Good morning, everyone. This is a first for me, too. I have never followed a president, and such an extraordinary honor. And to be bookend with the CEO of Duke Energy, and I know you're going to hear from the astronaut. So I'm going to do my best to hold this position of honor. My role inside of Ford is as a futurist, and I'm going to tell you straight up, I'm not a car person, and actually that's part of my value to the company. So our time together, I'm going to let you in on a few of my deepest, darkest secrets. That's why I call this deck Confessions of a Futurist. How many of you have ever gone to see a psychic? Raise your hand tall and proud. I know there are always people in the audience that refuse to raise their hand out of some sort of shame or embarrassment. I share this story because years ago, I went to see a psychic with my twin sister. And actually, it was her reading. She said, I want to go see a fortune teller. And I said, oh my God, that's a horrible idea. A waste of time and a waste of money. What I didn't say to her was that I was scared. What if they were to tell her something that she didn't want to know? And she said, oh my God, lighten up. It's just for fun. It's not like I actually believe. And she was right. We were having a great time as the tarot card reader flipped over one card after another card, relating each to her past, her present, and her future. And wouldn't you know it, when we got to the very last card, the tarot card reader flipped over the death card. And my non-believing sister became a convert on the spot. She was absolutely certain that this was an omen, a sign of bad things to come. It ruined the day, it ruined the weekend. We were actually on vacation. And I spent the following days, weeks, and even months trying to convince her that we didn't believe, that nothing lay in wait for her. And I should pause and tell you that she is alive and well. She is thriving. But the reason I tell you this story is because I think many people are afraid of the future. In that moment of fear, I think I said something to the effect of, good, bad, or indifferent, I never want to know what the future holds. And this, of course, is part of the human condition, right? We're uncomfortable with things that we cannot control or influence. Uncertainty is something that makes most of us very uncomfortable. And if you're an organization, though, you can't just bury your head. You have to lean into that uncertainty. And how is one to do that? I mean, I love the quote that we heard in the beginning where Bill Lee had said that it's the engineer's job to make consumers' lives better, serve them better in the future. But how are each of you to do that if you don't know what the future holds? Even when we know that we deep down cannot predict the future, we all do it. We all make assumptions about how we think the world is going to play out. When we get married, we assume it'll be for life. When we make an investment, we assume it'll pay off in the long run. And probably more problematic for every single person in this room, anyone in business, is that we assume that the thing that once made us successful will guarantee our success of our organization going forward. But of course, there are no guarantees in life. And my job as a futurist, ironically enough, is to remind people that absolutely no one can predict the future. I often tell people that instead of calling myself a futurist, I should rebadge myself as the polite contrarian. Because my job each and every day is to slow down conversations and say, wait a minute, what are the underlying assumptions on which you built your plan? What are the foundational viewpoints that you have that create that point of view? Most often, that those beliefs are so deeply rooted into our psyche, we can't even identify them, let alone challenge them. So my job as a futurist is to slow down the conversation and say, let's explore some of those underlying assumptions. We tend to assume that everyone shares our point of view, and that inconsistency can often be very detrimental to an organization's long-term success. So we're back to this notion that you cannot predict the future. So what are you to do? Well, for the last 15 years, I've been honing the skills and how organizations can learn to navigate this uncertainty. What do you do when you're faced with the unknown? We still must find ways to be very decisive, even when we're surrounded with all of this uncertainty. So instead of taking the traditional inside-out approach, most organizations, when they think about the future, start with a SWOT analysis. How many of you use a SWOT analysis? So if you don't recognize an acronym, SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the problem with the SWOT analysis is that essentially it's glorified navel gazing. It's basically asking, what do we do well and how do we continue to leverage that? But the fundamental flaw with this approach is that we do not get to decide what our strengths are. The strengths are decided by the marketplace, and the marketplace is very, very fickle. So if you want to prepare for an unknown future, the first thing you have to do is begin by exploring the things that you have no control or influence over. What we in the business call the STEEP categories: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political forces. While we readily concede that we cannot predict the future and know what it holds, we do believe that if you follow these 5 forces, you'll have a preview of the things that will shape consumer values, attitudes, and behaviors. So we're going to start with the worldview. Let's talk about the population. And we heard President Calderon already talk a little bit about how the population is growing. I want to give a little more context to that. In the 1900s, the global population was 1.5 billion people. And the last 100 years, the global population has more than tripled. And during that time, our consumption of things like water have more than doubled. You need not do the math to know that that's not sustainable. As we sit here today in Charlotte, we know that close to 1 billion people don't have access to clean or quality drinking water. Now, of course, we don't tend to think about it much here, but if we lived in South America, South Africa, Southeast Asia, water scarcity would be much more top of mind for us. And if you were a woman or child living in those areas, water would probably pervade your every waking moment. Because in those parts of the world, it is the responsibility of women and children to service the community's water needs. And they spend on average 3 hours a day looking for a water source. And when they find that water source is not clean, clear, or pristine, it's brown, murky, bacteria-ridden, and they fill these jerry cans that weigh about 40 pounds when they're full. And they push, pull, and drag them back to their community each and every day. Economists estimate that if you were to aggregate this singular task, you would generate a GDP larger than a country the size of France. That's our baseline. But by 2025, we'll be at 8.5 billion people. By 2040, 9 billion. By 2050, some people say 10 billion. Some estimates even go up to 11 billion. So that should call to mind how many more people will go without water. Now forget about water for a moment. What about food? We have no historical precedents to be absolutely confident that the planet has enough resources to feed a population that exceeds 9 billion people. I, however, take comfort in the words of E.O. Wilson, a Harvard-based biologist who's done extensive research on this area. And he says, we have nothing to fear. We actually can feed over 10 billion people indefinitely on one small condition. Every single person in the world would have to become a vegetarian. Now, what if not everyone's willing to agree? I mean, it's just like the climate change issue. You need everyone all in to solve these problems. What if not everyone's all in on the beef issue? Could some countries opt out? Could the battle of beef be the tipping point towards the next world war? Now, if giving up beef is something that's totally unimaginable, you don't have to worry too much, because we actually have the ability to grow beef in a petri dish. This was done some years ago, but at a very high cost. It costs over $330,000 to create 2 hamburgers. But there is hope. Earlier this year, there were a group of people that got together that said this is probably going to go mainstream. It was led by the Department of Agriculture and the FDA. And right now, the current battle is, what will we call this petri-grown dish? Now, of course, the cattle growers want to call it fake beef, and the petri dish growers want to call it clean beef. Now, maybe this doesn't hold enough appeal to you, and you could adopt some of the practices that we've seen worldwide. You could eat crickets. In fact, over 2 billion people today consume crickets as part of their daily diet. And this is directly tied to the climate change issue that we just talked about, that we've just heard so much extensively about. Did you know that it takes 2,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of dried beef? Guess how much water it takes to produce 1 pound of cricket powder? 1 gallon. And this is why the countries that I mentioned, the regions, South America, South Africa, Southeast Asia, are already adopting this as part of their diet. It's where water scarcity is most pronounced. When I talk about population growth, it often catches people off guard, particularly in North America. And that's because the growth I'm talking about is not happening here. It's happening in other parts of the world. In fact, it's happening in the parts of the world that are least capable of handling it. Now, every single slide that you'll see today are my own illustrations, with the exception of this one. This one comes from an organization called World Mapper. And what they did is they took your standard landmass map, and then below, on the lower half, is they expanded or contracted each country according to where the growth or decline will happen in terms of population. Now you can see here in the bluish color, the United States gets substantially smaller. Is there anyone in the room from Canada? Oh, my Canadian friends, look what's happening to your country. It's disappearing off the map by 2050. And actually, that's kind of a good thing for you in some ways because it's actually land mass per capita. And so it's basically saying you have a lot of land for every single resident. But if you look at the mustard and the green on the right side, that's India and China respectively. That is where the growth is happening more rapidly. And as we just heard contextualized a little bit earlier, the way that I think about it, and the growth in China is so rapid, it's like adding 7 new Chicagos to that country each and every year. So why is this happening? Why is North America, the western parts of Europe, this so-called rich world getting smaller? Well, we have declining fertility. In the 1970s, the average fertility rate worldwide was 5 babies for every woman. Ladies, raise your hand if you've given birth to 5 children. Oh, I do see one hand. Bravo, bravo, thank you. I appreciate your efforts to stabilize the population. You are a huge overachiever. Because right now the global average is 2 babies for every woman. And actually in the United States, it's below that. It's like 1.8. What that means in the most simple terms is that we're not having enough babies to offset the deaths. And so the population is getting smaller. This phenomenon is driven largely by education. The more educated your female population, the fewer babies they have. And so this is why the most advanced economies see the shortest or slowest rate in terms of fertility. As a direct byproduct of that, it means that the base population is rapidly aging. When you don't have enough babies to offset the deaths, the average age gets older. In the United States, every 7 seconds, another person turns 65. In the coming years, there'll be more people over the age of 50 than under 50 throughout the EU. And this will create an extraordinary number of challenges. Add to the fact that scientists say that we have gotten to a point with advances in nutrition, healthcare, and medical science and technology that the first person to live to be 150 years of age has already been born. So look to the person to your right and the person to your left. Which one of you wants to live to be a century and a half? Oh, I have some takers up front. That's awesome. Okay. So before I go further, let me caution you that the United Nations would tell you that the aging of the world's population is going to be one of the greatest challenges that mankind faces. And let me break that down for you for a minute. And I'm going to pick on President Calderon if you'll indulge me for a minute. So I love that you want to live to be a century and a half, and I wish you all the luck in the world. My question for you is, how long would you like to work?
Only 1 year.
1 year. 1 year, bravo. I wish you even more luck on that endeavor. But if you were to follow the global average, you would work between the ages of 15 and 65. That's very problematic if you plan to live to be 150 years of age. You'll only work for 1/3 of your life. It's not economically sustainable. And that actually is the biggest root of the problem with the aging population. Now, economists like to kind of explain what this means in terms of what they call the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is a measure that tells you how many workers do you have supporting your non-working population. In the United States, when we established the Social Security system, it's estimated that we had 44 workers for every single retiree. We're at a moment in time where we only have 2. We actually have less than 2 workers for every single retiree. Now, if we look to Japan as a leading indicator of how this will play out for aging economies, we pick on Japan because they have the oldest population in terms of percentage. In the coming years, they're going to have more retirees than workers. Specifically, they're going to have 108 retirees supported by every 100 workers. So let's talk through the consequences of that. That means your economic output will slow down. Your GDP will drop. Japan, like many Asian countries, will do better than most because of its famously high savings rate. But that can't last indefinitely. And today we regard Japan, generally speaking, as a technological powerhouse. But how long can they hold on to that title when they no longer have the money to invest and innovate? And what happens when they lose that badge of honor? They're likely to lose their influence worldwide in terms of social, political, and economic influence. Where is that going to migrate to? Well, China and India are really good bets. Now, China, because of the population growth that I showed you earlier, has great economic opportunities in front of it. But it is aging more rapidly than any other country in the world. China has, for over a century, done social engineering programs to control its population, and it really comes down to feast or famine. You have too many people, they starve to death. If you don't have enough people, you don't have enough economic growth. And so I've been trying to balance this. In the 70s, they had a program called Late, Long, Few. And what they said in a propaganda campaign was they said, we would like you to have children later in life, to wait longer periods between sibling births and have fewer children. In the 1990s, they decided that wasn't aggressive enough, and so they instituted the one-child policy. What they didn't anticipate was the one-child policy would create what's known as the 4-2-1 dilemma. And what that means is that that one child, that singleton, could eventually find themselves in a situation where they're financially responsible for 4 grandparents and 2 parents. In other words, their informal dependency ratio would be 6 non-workers to 1 worker. It's not sustainable. And indeed, it is the reason why China pulled back on its one-child policy. But some economists say that it was too late. In fact, China's already hit its peak worker population. So they're struggling to find a mandate to grow rich before they grow old. Well, let me turn your attention to India for a second. India is one of the youngest populations in the world, along with Mexico, Afghanistan, a couple other countries. When Japan has a 108 retirees to every 100 workers ratio, India will have 24 retirees for every 100 workers. This is known as a demographic dividend, a rare and powerful opportunity to change its position on a global stage. In fact, it is the same dividend that brought China to its current economic might. It's just that China's ending its demographic dividend just as India's starting theirs. But India's ability to reproduce, to duplicate, replicate what China accomplished is really in question. Fundamentally, it's because they must find ways to meaningfully educate and employ the masses. Now, city living is going to look dramatically different. Where are we going to put all these people? There are about 25, close to 30 megacities worldwide, and a megacity is a city that has a population of 10 million people or more. Here in the United States, we only have 2. We have New York and we have LA, and we're actually kind of cheating because it depends on how you cut the boundaries. But nonetheless, if you've ever had the misfortune of driving in either one of those cities, you know how difficult it can be to live, work, play, get around in a megacity. Well, let me direct your attention to Beijing. Beijing isn't even the world's largest megacity. Oh, see? It's not even the world's largest megacity. It has 23 million people in the city center. And today, their average daily commute is 5 hours a day. Now, this is an infrastructure problem. Infrastructure is part of the problem, but China actually has a highway that is 50 lanes wide. And 2 years ago, that highway experienced a traffic jam that lasted 12 days long. It's almost inconceivable. And so automotive companies actually are saying that we can't just keep adding more vehicles to the road. All that's going to result in is more gridlock. And so mobility solutions are changing far and wide. As I walked over here, I saw the Bird scooters, which you can just pick up on any street corner and get yourself to your local destination. The solutions that are going to deal with this sort of global gridlock are not going to be resolved exclusively by original equipment manufacturers like car companies. They're going to come from many other sources. So I just want to now move you into a slightly different level. Let's talk about the marketplace. Those things I just covered, they're macro trends. Those are things that you have 2, 3, 4 decades to try to deal with when you think about how you're going to address these long-term changes. But these marketplaces are things that are a little bit more near-term, and they're a little bit more business-oriented. Okay, so the population is changing. Science is advancing. How is it possible that we're going to have people that live to be 150 years? It's because we know so much more about the human genome. Now that we've decoded the sequencing of the human genome, we can actually tell when a baby is born things like their height. How tall do we think they're going to be? And we can come in with a plus or minus error rate of about 4 centimeters. So it's pretty good in terms of prediction. In addition to that, we can determine when a child is born the possibility or probability of them suffering chronic diseases, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, all of these things. And maybe we can adopt different lifestyle skills. But what happens if we start changing their insurance when they're just infants? When we start to predict that we think you have a higher risk for this, so from the time that you're born, insurance agencies are already calculating new actuarial tables for you. Even more alarming is that science tells us that when you're born, they can predict your IQ rate. And there are actually some discussions about how you might terminate pregnancies if you're to give birth to a child that has a lower than average IQ. So technology is interesting because we're at this moment in time because just because we can doesn't mean we should. And as we grapple with these ethics, it's a geopolitical problem because some countries are adopting we're not going to adapt it at all until we figure out the ethics. And other countries are saying, well, let's figure out the technology first, and once we have it in place, then we'll figure out the ethical restrictions. And when the code is cracked on any of these technologies, it could totally upend the political system, the economic system as we know it. So what does this mean for work? Work is going to change quite a bit when we think about talent, the race for talent. And the global race for talent has already begun because technology has advanced in a way that it has polarized the job market. Most employers need very high-skilled workers or very low-skilled workers, and most of us fall somewhere in between. And we see early signs of this. I talk about Japan again. Japan has senior leadership positions that go unfilled against a backspread of growing unemployment. So how will work be done? Who will do the work? We know that manufacturing will look dramatically different. Right now, we have 3D printing that could fundamentally change what manufacturing looks like. But right now, we're only doing it with plastic resins. And that has extraordinary applications. But the new wave in 3D printing is to start work with metals, steel, aluminums, so that you create things in your garage. And actually, if any of you have $100,000 to spare, you could put one of these in your garage. And better yet, you don't even have to pay for that investment because organizations like Tech Shop will let you have a membership where you can go in and have access to the most cutting-edge technology that many companies can't even afford to bring in-house themselves. Now, artificial intelligence has everyone quite frightened. What is artificial intelligence going to do? And I remain forever an optimist. I think the real problem with artificial intelligence is one of PR. Because if it had never been called artificial intelligence, if it had been called augmented intelligence, we might have a totally different viewpoint of it. And augmented intelligence is probably the more appropriate application of how we'll see this work out in the future. And today we already see doctors doing this. So when you take a radiologist who has extraordinary experience in looking at X-ray scans to search for signs of cancer, they have a very high success rate. And when they compare that to a computer artificial machine learning system, the computer couldn't even match success of an experienced doctor. And that's because experienced doctors know that there are lots of false negatives. They know that shadows can create misconceptions, and they take all of that experience and it helps evaluate it. But if you were to combine that experience of a physician with augmented intelligence, we see the rate of the doctor's performance increase dramatically. So it's not one that actually meant to replace doctors or physicians, but to improve their efficiency, their effectiveness, and at the end, hopefully reduce cost. So now I want to move into the middle of the bullseye. What does this mean for you? Because these are challenges that probably are things that don't come into your purview on a regular basis. And actually, that's the role of a futurist, is that when I work with designers, engineers, what I'm trying to bring to light to them are things that they rarely have the time to explore, to give them a springboard for inspiration so that when they take these ideas and partner it with their expertise, they can come up with innovations that neither one of us could have ever found on our own. But let me tell you about the challenges that you personally will have at hand as you try to do this. With neuroscience advances, we know much more about the brain today than we ever did before. Did you know that the brain makes up 2% of your total body weight, but it consumes over 20% of your body's energy. Now, add to the fact that we live in a time where we're constantly connected. And so the fatigue of that organ, that brain, is actually much more vulnerable than any other organ in your body. And we know that when you're constantly connected, just digitally distracted, all those things, we tend to be overstimulated. We tend to be a little bit more sensitive and more aggressive at times, more agitated. Ironically, when we live with this time where we have all this information at our fingertips, our ability to determine what's accurate, credible, or reliable has never been more daunting or difficult. So we have to spend much more diligence on how we do our research. But it's hard to do that research because the average office worker is interrupted every 3 minutes. From a phone call, an email, a text message, a news blast, any of these things can interrupt that moment of flow when you're into your most productive, deepest thinking. And when the interruption comes, it takes over 20 minutes for you to return to whatever it was that you were working on before the disruption occurred. And so it's little wonder that 2, maybe 3 years ago, scientists revealed a study that said human beings have a shorter attention span than goldfish. Now, I don't know exactly how they test it. I imagine little electrodes with the fish swimming in the bowl. But the goldfish have 9-second attention span. Humans have an 8-second attention span. And we know through science that it is shrinking because of all of the digital distractions that we have. So I get to what I call the public service portion of today's programming, and it's multitasking. Multitasking is a myth. We have, as a society, taught ourselves that we're very efficient and effective at doing multiple things at once. But science now can prove that you can do more harm than good. Only 2% of the world's population are effective at multitasking. And I'm willing to concede that all 2% have gathered here for a week. But let me tell you that when you go home and you talk to the remaining 98%, let them know that they do more harm than good. Because basically what happens is your brain loses its ability to separate critical information from the surrounding gray noise, if you will. Daniel Kahneman is a behavioral economist who talks about this in his book, Thinking Slow and Fast. And what he says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, is that if you think of your brain in an artificial construct of having 2 systems, system 1 are the parts of the brain that you are born with, things that take no attention, no concentration, they just happen naturally, versus system 2, which takes concentration, repetition, muscle memory, focus. Now imagine you're driving down the highway and someone cuts you off. System 1 is the part of your brain that says, flip them off, lay on the horn. Maybe you should tailgate them and show them just how menacing their behavior is. System 2 is the part of your brain that says, oh, no, that is a really bad idea. It's not safe for you, it's not safe for them, it's not safe for anyone else on the road. The problem is that System 2's ability to override System 1 is impaired when you're drunk, under the influence of drugs, sleep deprived, or when you're multitasking. Now, if that hasn't convinced you, let me tell you another study, an infamous study, where somebody brought together a group of people and he had everyone take an IQ test. He aggregated their scores, averaged them, and set a baseline score for the group. Then everyone in the group got high, and they asked them to take the test over again. Not surprisingly, the group's performance suffered. It dropped 4 percentage points. When everyone sobered up, they asked them to take the test, another IQ test, for final time. But while they were taking the exam, they distracted them with multitask assignments. Collectively, the group's performance dropped 10 percentage points. Now, I would never tell you that it would be better to be high than it is to multitask. But I do believe that's exactly what the scientist was getting to. And so I tell you this because all of you have extraordinary influence in the marketplace. I believe that an organization with the scale, the global footprint, the intellectual power of AEE truly has the ability to create the future. But you really must literally find ways to free up your mind, to challenge the conventions, to try new things, to be the polite contrarian in the room, to come up with new solutions. Now, the world has jumped on the STEAM bandwagon, and I have nothing against STEAM. I think STEAM is extraordinarily important, but we can never forget the importance of arts. Art in terms in the STEAM acronym is so important, and this was highlighted in a study that looked at Nobel Prize winners in the area of science over the last 100 years. And during that time, they said, What was so extraordinary about that specific scientist in that given year versus their contemporaries that allowed them to win this extraordinary prize, to make like historical breakthrough advances? Well, it had to do with the arts. If you were a musician, you were 2 times as likely as your other scientist counterparts to get a Nobel Prize. If you were an artist, fine art, drawing, painting, sculpture, you were 7 times as likely as your scientific counterparts to get their award. But if you are a performer in the dramatic arts, you are 22 times as likely to get the Nobel Prize than your non-artistic counterparts. So as you tackle the science, don't forget the humanities. So I began this presentation by telling you that I can't predict the future, but I do believe that you can. You can predict the future if you choose to create it. If you let go of the notion that anything is set in stone, it opens up an extraordinary, limitless, endless spectrum of possibilities, and it's for you to create it. So I hope that's what you guys do today, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.